And we're joined on the phone today by author Keith Elliot Greenberg, and we're talking about his new book, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. Hey Keith, how you doing today?
Good, good.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Well, let's talk a bit about your new book here, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. Can you tell the listeners a bit about it?
Yes, Too Sweet, in my opinion, is a historic document, and it's a snapshot of the indie wrestling scene, both today and historically. It's a story about the outlaw promotions of times past, then the early indie promotions, the post-ECW era, and since 2012, the momentum that's built up to what we see today. And I guess the manifestation of it all was the creation of AEW, but indie wrestling still thrives and flourishes, and it's still evolving. The revolution continues.
Yeah, obviously that's a very long and wide history. How did you decide which time periods to focus on when you were kind of leading up to AEW?
Well, other books I've written also dealt with the history of professional wrestling. I don't think that you can view anything in isolation. And rather than just doing a laundry list of the various indie promotions, I felt we had to reach back into time. What I find with professional wrestling, because it was a business that people were very secretive about, when certain people passed away, aspects of the history were lost. So I felt it was important to put everything in a historical context, get to some of the people who were there, and give the fans a document. So 50 years from now, they can open up this book and understand the phenomenon.
Again, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution is out now, and I know you obviously went around to various shows and promotions and talked to the wrestlers themselves. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how you put the book together?
Yeah, what I did was I started showing up at different events. Of course, I told the promoters that I'd be there. I didn't just turn up unannounced. And I'd go into the dressing room and I'd ask the different wrestlers how they got to the place where they were, what their aspirations were. Certain guys, their goal was to be in WWE. I was, spoke to Joey Janela the entire time. When I met him, he was the king of the Jersey Indies. When the book ends, he and Marco Stunt and Orange Cassidy are going off and Jungle Boy are going off to their the first AEW Dynamite broadcast. They're doing their last indie show at this place called the House of Independence in Asbury Park, and a new chapter in their lives and the lives of professional wrestling are beginning. There was a fellow named Danny Maff. He was, I believe, 46 when I interviewed him. He'd been knocking around the indies for a generation, and around the time I finished the first draft, he was signed by Ring of Honor, and he told me it was the first contract he'd ever signed. So there are a lot of very deep stories here, very soulful stories.
Awesome. Were you able to check out any of the indie shows around Minnesota here? I know we've got quite a few of them.
That's one part of the country I didn't get to in the course of doing this particular book. However, there's quite a bit in there about the history of professional wrestling in Minnesota, and I'm currently working on a sequel. This one, as it turns out, dwells on professional wrestling during the time of the coronavirus, and that would be a goal, to get to Minnesota.
Excellent. Well, of course, nowadays the big story is all elite wrestling, and that's kind of like the ultimate underdog story of the guys, on the indies, kind of banding together, to take on the giant corporation of WWE.
Yeah, and you could say that. WWE has hardly folded in the face of all of this, and in fact, if you look at NXT, as I point out in the book, there's a very strong indie vibe in NXT. Many of the trainers come from the indies. I believe from what the wrestlers told me, Triple H has a great appreciation of the indies. And, you know, even though WWE is depicted often as the evil corporate overlord, they're still making innovations. You look at the cinematic matches that have occurred since, since COVID-19 started. You look at the Thunderdome. WWE still has a great impact on the industry. But yes, there was this consensus that if you weren't in WWE, you weren't successful. And I believe that perception has now changed.
Well, Keith, does it seem a bit ironic to you that AEW is maybe slowly morphing into kind of not WWE light, but it's different in a lot of ways, obviously. But when you get to a certain size or a certain level, it seems like you start to turn into more of the corporate side of things.
I think there's always a fear of that. I am sure that the people in AEW are aware of that. Because sometimes, I was a writer for WWE's publications for 22 years. And so I saw an evolution. I remember when I first started writing for WWE, it was small enough that Vince McMahon would take employees out to eat after shows, it was that intimate. And then things got big. There was an explosion. And when things expand, whether, it's a wrestling company or an ice cream company, all these rules and protocols come in, and sometimes you lose sight of, the dream that you had in the first place. And, this is a topic that's come up with many of the talent in AEW. I'm sure Tony Khan is aware of those pitfalls as well. There are things that are unavoidable. They're on a major network, and I'm sure there are standards that they have to adhere to. But I do think there's also an awareness of not to fall into that trap, and it's too early now to see whether they achieve that.
Well, Keith, are you finding now that a lot of the wrestlers are happy on the indie scene? Maybe they don't want to go to WWE or AEW, and maybe or is that still a goal for most of the wrestlers out there?
I'd say it's mixed. I also say, there are guys who say they don't want to go to WWE, and they actually do. It's kind of the trendy thing to say. The difference between now and, say, 20 years ago is that you can make an actual living on the indie scene. Back 20 years ago, the indie scene consisted of cards centered around somebody who'd recently been released by WWE or WCW. After a few years, you had people who were legitimate 100% indie stars, people who you could, build shows around who had never been in one of the major promotions, and people who could make a living doing this. Also, the creation of YouTube allowed fans all over the world to see different styles, and it created a market for people not just in the United States, but from Japan and the UK and Germany and Australia. And, people could actually travel the world and make a living on the indies. So there are people who make a living on the indies. When I was at a show recently in Chicago, I was talking to Brian Pillman Jr., and he told me that during the COVID era, he made a good living selling merchandise online. So you don't need a giant corporation to validate you. Maybe you wouldn't make as much money, but you can still make money. And I think the goals are different, but certainly most indie stars grew up watching WWE. When they fantasized about becoming a wrestler, that was a place where they saw themselves going. And I would say that a large amount still want to end up there one day.
And I know you alluded to it a little bit, but what has 2020 done and this whole pandemic thing, what has that done to indie wrestling? Has it thrown a wrench in things, or do you think will it have a much bigger impact than that in the long run?
I think we're analyzing the impact. It's too early to see. You need hindsight for that. Certainly, it threw a wrench in things. It sidelined people. It, put the brakes on a momentum that was happening. That said, I've spoken to a number of indie wrestlers over the last few weeks. One guy told me that he went back and rewatched a lot of his matches. He's had the time to do that. Tweaked his routine. Started training different parts of his body. Started working on different different maneuvers in the ring. I spoke to another wrestler who actually went down to Mexico and had stem cell therapy to repair shoulder damage. So there are definitely wrestlers who are using this time off to become better at their craft, and there's others who were sitting around very frustrated. And certainly their momentum is off, and it will probably, in the short term at least, impact them negatively.
Well, I have noticed other countries are, maybe handling things a little better than we are, and I know Japan has already had some shows with live fans, and so things obviously are going to get back on track here at some point.
Yes, and Japan, they have the virtue. Well, I wouldn't say virtue. They have the advantage of being a homogeneous society, and in a homogeneous society, you can impose rules, and the majority of the society will follow. So it seems like Japan has gone ahead of the coronavirus a little better than we have. And I saw just this past weekend, they had a show in a baseball stadium. It was limited capacity, but it looked like, it's still a nice-sized show. And, we're not quite there yet. And, when you look at some of the numbers involving COVID-19, it's still a bit frightening. And hopefully, at a certain point, we can all get back to our old lives, whether it involves professional wrestling or anything else.
Definitely. Well, again, the new book, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, I know that's just out now, and you mentioned working on some other things. Is there anything else we should be watching out for here?
No, but what I will say is I am doing the early research on my next book. It's a sequel on it. It is about wrestling during the time of the coronavirus. I'm still learning things. I'm still making discoveries, and I'm sure I'll be excited about that as I am about Too Sweet Inside the Wrestling Revolution. In the meantime, I just hope fans read it and enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, Keith, I'm definitely enjoying it, and hopefully I can speak with you again when the next one comes out.
But you feel free to reach out to me at any time.
All right, Keith, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dustin.
And again, that was author Keith Elliot Greenberg. His new book, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, is available now.